Welcome to my Vintage Eternal weekend recap. This is the deck that I chose to play. I chose to play Doomsday, same as I did for the Legacy component of the event. Coming into this, unlike in Legacy, I wasn't actually tied to playing Doomsday. I tried a bunch of other decks before finally settling on it. This was always a candidate, but was never a surefire thing. Among the other decks that I had tried were things like Oath of Druids. This was something that I was somewhat keen on playing coming into the event. Just generally find the deck pretty fun. It's it's a preordained deck, which is one of my main requisites or main preferences when I'm playing Vintage and trying to do well, of course. And this deck, it's a preordained deck. It has most of the Xerox core. It can be very controlling when it needs to be. Plays Oko as an alternate win con. But unfortunately, when I was testing it, I was having a little bit too much trouble with it. And I think against some of the bug decks as much as anything else, I just felt like Oath kept getting removed. So I ended up moving away from this. I didn't test it a great deal. It's just, the first league that I entered, I was feeling I didn't feel like it was working well enough. From there, I went to test this. This is a deck that I'd played once or twice before. It's kind of a mashup between Oath of Druids and Paradoxical Outcome. I'd found it really fun to play, and so I gave it a couple of goes in a couple of leagues, and ended up finding myself in a position a little bit too often where I was stuck top decking, and this deck, once it's in top deck mode, just doesn't play well at all. So I dismissed this based on that. I couldn't deal with how badly it played in top deck mode when I've got to play over a 10 round event. It kind of seems to have short bursts, but then over time, the lack of consistency, I think, I felt was going to creep up on me. So I moved away from this as well. The next deck that I checked out was the blue white red Xerox deck. This plays in a way it's super consistent, at least for Vintage. It's very controlling. It's a straight up control deck realistically, but it gets to play a bunch of Pyroblasts. It's got Dreadhorde Arcanists to flashback all your preordains and your ponders and your brainstorms and your ancestral. The reason I ended up moving away from this is because I figured this would be great against outcome if we played against a lot of outcome, and I was winning most of my Xerox mirrors, but I was feeling really poor against the Bazaar decks. And bunches of other random nonsense. Just felt like they were stomping me pretty quickly. I've also had issues with these kinds of decks when playing against decks like Doomsday, which we decided on, and even sometimes things like Oath. So while I won a lot of mirrors in the leagues that I was playing, I decided against this as well. From there, I decided to check out Outcome briefly. I was fairly sure I wasn't going to play Outcome. Once again, I want to play a preordained deck. And when I say a preordained deck, I don't mean one that's playing like one or two. I want to be playing the full four, ideally. Despite the Oath Outcome deck that we looked at. In my testing, basically I found, for me, I feel this deck it's known to be really powerful. It's known to be very strong, and it has some really broken starts. And it has a lot of play to it, I think. I personally was finding that there were enough situations where I just wasn't confident enough with what I was doing, or that I was making the right play. And I think maybe there are times when I'm just playing too aggressively. I also just found too many problems with things like, collector roofs and opponents' Lavinias and things like that, where it was doing my head in a little bit. So I ended up calling it quits on this and settled on Doomsday. I'd played Doomsday a little bit before. I'd played it in Legacy, of course. I took it through a couple of leagues. It seemed fairly straightforward. Look, it has a mix of its own set of issues, but I just thought it was, something I could deal with a little bit better. And means I get, slightly better mana base. I get to play with Necropotence, which can be pretty absurdly powerful. I have a fast combo like Outcome, and I think it's, to me, more straightforward. So in terms of the deck itself, here's a little bit of the breakdown. We have, actually, there's a couple of split roll cards that I'm just going to pull out now. Okay, so in terms of the deck, there's fast mana plus Black Lotus. There are a bunch of draw spells. A bunch of draw spells that kind of, let us start to filter through our deck fairly quickly. So we've got Gitaxian Probes, we've got 4 Preordains, we've got an Ancestral Recall, we've got a Gush, we've got a, Peak Ponder. All of this is just trying to help us find our combo pieces. We've got Ancestral and Gush to let us do that. The reason these are mixed mode cards are that we often want to build a Black Lotus into our Doomsday pile. We often want to build an Ancestral or a Gush into our Doomsday pile. So these are part combo cards and part cards that either accelerate us or draw us into our combo. We're playing 4 tutors. So I'll talk about this in a second, but the 4 tutors that we are playing are a Vampiric Tutor, Demonic Tutor. Demonic Consultation is kind of a tutor and a combo card. I'm probably more inclined to leave it as a combo card, but it can also find you things like a Flusterstorm or a Force of Will in a hurry. And then Merchant Scroll to help us find just typically one of these two, or sometimes like, a Flusterstorm or a Force of Will or something like that. Got Time Walk, which is Time Walk. A bunch of pieces of interaction. So we have a single removal spell in Chain of Vapor, just to help us remove some troublesome permanents. That might be things like a Sphere, it might be things like a Lavinia. Then we have a bunch of counter spells. You'll notice that there's a Mystical Dispute in the deck. So Mystical Dispute is a bit of an interesting one in that it's probably not as good as Flusterstorm, as pushing through our combo, but is much better at protecting against things like Lavinia and Leovold and Narset. So it's kind of, it's a nice, relatively broad card while still being kind of narrow. And then from there, of course, we're playing a standard 4 forces, a Force of Negation, as much as anything else to stop our opponent from getting to play their game properly, and a couple of Dazes as well, and 2 Flusters. From there, we've got the actual core of the combo, which is 4 Doomsdays. Necro, which you could also include within the draw component of our deck, but basically this is, if this hits the board against a control deck, it's probably game over. Necro just will draw us too far through our deck. A few Street Race, they help us get into or through our pile. Thassa's Oracles are our win cons. And then Demonic Consultation. If you can cast this with a Thassa's Oracle on the trigger on the stack, and the Consultation resolves, you'll deck yourself and you'll win the game. From here, we're playing. This is our sideboard, so we have a Massacre as kind of like an anti-hate bears, and you could bring it in against Xerox to hit their mentor tokens. 2 Tabernacles for Leyline of the Voids for Dredge and other Bazaar decks. Mindbreak Trap for other combo decks. Flusterstorm for blue decks. Caracas is mostly there for blue decks as well. It hits Lavinia and Leovold, which are just 2 hate bears that come out of blue decks that can cause us a bit of a problem. And then these 5 cards for shops. So 2 Hercules Recalls, 3 Steel Sabotages. We just want to bounce their lock piece or their board and go off. In terms of whether or not I think the deck was correctly constructed for the weekend, I'm not 100% sure. I haven't played enough Doomsday to have strong opinions about how to build the deck, so I just cribbed the list from someone else. A Japanese player called Singpan Man, who tends to do quite well. He's built it a little bit differently, I noticed, to a lot of other Doomsday decks. For starters, there are 0 Duresses. I have no particular issue with that. I'm not sure how I feel about Duress. I haven't actually tried it, to be honest. And then the other main differences are that he's playing a Merchant Scroll and a 15th land. So it's possible one of these could be like an extra Flusterstorm, and one could be maybe like a Duress or a Treasure Cruise. And I think they're ones I might actually try to play with moving on. They're the main differences from any other list. So I think apart from that, it did seem to be reasonably stock, which is why I was happy to pick it up. So that's enough of the deck. I'll get on to our matches now.